22. We had a treehouse in a big elm which overhung a vacant lot in Castle Rock. There's a moving company on that lot today, and the elm is gone. Progress. It was sort of a social club, although it had no name. There were 5, maybe 6 steady guys and some other wet ends who just hung around. We'd let them come up when there was a card game and we needed some fresh blood. The game was usually blackjack, and we played for pennies, nickel limit. But you got double money on blackjack and 5 card under, triple money on 6 card under, although Teddy was the only guy crazy enough to go for that. The sides of the treehouse were planks, scavenged from the shit pile behind Mackey Lumber and Building Supply on Carbine Road. They were splintery and full of knotholes we plugged with either toilet paper or paper towels. The roof was a corrugated tin sheet we hawked from the dump, looking over our shoulders all the time we were hustling it out of there because the dump custodian's dog was supposed to be a real kid-eating monster. We found a screen door out there on the same day. It was fly-proof, but really rusty. I mean, that rust was extreme. No matter what time of day you looked out that screen door, it looked like sunset. Besides playing cards, the club was a good place to go and smoke cigarettes and look at girly books. There were 6 battered tin ashtrays that said Camels on the bottom, a lot of centerfolds tacked to the splintery walls, 20 or 30 dog-eared packs of bike cards. Teddy got them from his uncle, who ran the Castle Rock stationery shop. When Teddy's uncle asked him one day what kind of cards we played, Teddy said we had cribbage tournaments, and Teddy's uncle thought that was just fine. A set of plastic poker chips, and a pile of ancient Master Detective murder magazines to leaf through if there was nothing else shaking. We also built a 12 by 10-inch secret compartment under the floor to hide most of this stuff in on the rare occasions when some kid's father decided it was time to do the "we're really good pals" routine. When it rained, being in the club was like being inside a Jamaican steel drum. But that summer there had been no rain. It had been the driest and hottest since 1907, or so the newspapers said, and on that Friday preceding the Labor Day weekend and the start of another school year, even the goldenrod in the fields and the ditches beside the back roads looked parched and poorly. Nobody's garden had done doodly squat that year, and the big displays of canning stuff in the Castle Rock red and white were still there, gathering dust. No one had anything to put up that summer except maybe dandelion wine. Teddy and Chris and I were up in the club on that Friday morning, glooming to each other about school being so near, and playing cards and swapping the same old traveling salesman jokes and Frenchman jokes. How do you know when a Frenchman's been in your backyard? Well, your garbage cans are empty and your dog is pregnant. Teddy would try to look offended, but he was the first one to bring in a joke as soon as he heard it, only switching Frenchman to Polak. The elm gave good shade, but we already had our shirts off, so we wouldn't sweat them up too bad. We were playing 3-penny scat, the dullest card game ever invented, but it was too hot to think about anything more complicated. We'd had a pretty fair scratch ball team until the middle of August, and then a lot of kids just drifted away, too hot. I was down to my ride and building spades. I'd started with 13, gotten an 8 to make 21, and nothing had happened since then. Chris knocked. I took my last draw and got nothing helpful. 29, Chris said, laying down diamonds. 22, Teddy said, looking disgusted. Piss up a rope, I said, and tossed my cards onto the table face down. Gordy's out. Oh, Gordy just bit the bag and stepped out the door, Teddy bugled, and then gave out with his patented Teddy Duchamp laugh. Ee-hee-hee, like a rusty nail being slowly hauled out of a rotten board. Well, he was weird. We all knew it. He was as close to being 13 like the rest of us, but the thick glasses and the hearing aid he wore sometimes made him look like an old man. Kids were always trying to cadge smokes off him in the street, but the bulge in his shirt was just his hearing aid battery. In spite of the glasses and the flesh-colored button always screwed into his ear, Teddy couldn't see very well and often misunderstood the things people said to him. In baseball, you had to have him play the fences, way beyond Chris in left field and Billy Greer in right. You just hoped no one would hit one that far, because Teddy would go grimly after it, see it or not. Every now and then he got bonked a good one, and once he went out cold when he ran full-tilt boogie into the fence by the treehouse. He lay there on his back, with his eyes showing whites for almost 5 minutes, and I got scared. Then he woke up and walked around with a bloody nose and a huge purple lump rising on his forehead, trying to claim that the ball was foul. His eyesight was just naturally bad, but there was nothing natural about what happened to his ears. Back in those days when it was cool to get your hair cut so that your ears stuck out like a couple of jug handles, Teddy had Castle Rock's first Beatle haircut. 4 years before anyone in America had ever heard of the Beatles. He kept his ears covered because they looked like 2 lumps of warm wax. One day when he was 8, Teddy's father got pissed at him for breaking a plate. His mother was working at the shoe factory in South Paris when it happened, and by the time she found out about it, it was all over. Teddy's dad took Teddy over to the big wood stove at the back of the kitchen and shoved the side of Teddy's head down against one of the cast-iron burner plates. He held it down there for about 10 seconds. Then he yanked Teddy up by the hair of the head and did the other side. Then he called the Central Maine General Emergency Unit and told them to come get his boy. Then he hung up the phone, went into the closet, got his .410, and sat down to watch the daytime stories on TV with the shotgun laid across his knees. When Mrs. Burroughs from next door came over to ask if Teddy was all right, she'd heard the screaming, Teddy's dad pointed the shotgun at her. Mrs. Burroughs went out of the Duchamp house at roughly the speed of light, locked herself into her own house, and called the police. When the ambulance came, Mr. Duchamp let the orderlies in and then went out on the back porch to stand guard, while they wheeled Teddy to the old port-holed Buick ambulance on a stretcher. Teddy's dad explained to the orderlies that while the fucking brass hats said the area was clear, there were still Kraut snipers everywhere. One of the orderlies asked Teddy's dad if he thought he could hold on. Teddy's dad smiled tightly and told the orderly he'd hold till hell was a Frigidaire dealership if that's what it took. The orderly saluted, and Teddy's dad snapped it right back at him. A few minutes after the ambulance left, the state police arrived and relieved Norman Duchamp of duty. He'd been doing odd things like shooting cats and lighting fires in mailboxes for over a year, and after the atrocity he visited upon his son, they had a quick hearing and sent him to Togus, which is a VA hospital. Togus is where you have to go if you're a Section 8. Teddy's dad had stormed the beach at Normandy, and that's just the way Teddy always put it. Teddy was proud of his old man, in spite of what his old man had done to him, and Teddy went with his mom to visit him every week. He was the dumbest guy we hung around with, I guess, and he was crazy. He'd take the craziest chances you can imagine and get away with them. His big thing was what he called truck dodging. He'd run out in front of him on 196, and sometimes they'd miss him by bare inches. God knew how many heart attacks he'd caused, and he'd be laughing while the wind blast from the passing truck rippled his clothes. It scared us because his vision was so lousy, Coke bottle glasses or not. It seemed like only a matter of time before he misjudged one of those trucks. And you had to be careful what you dared him, because Teddy would do anything on a dare. "Gordy's out, hee-hee-hee." "Screw," I said, and picked up a master detective to read while they played it out. I turned to "He stomped the pretty co-ed to death in a stalled elevator," and got right into it. Teddy picked up his cards, gave them one brief look, and said, "I knock." "You four-eyed pile of shit," Chris cried. "The pile of shit has 1,000 eyes," Teddy said gravely, and both Chris and I cracked up. Teddy stared at us with a slight frown as if wondering what had gotten us laughing. That was another weird thing about the cat. He was always coming out with weird stuff like, "The pile of shit has 1,000 eyes," and you could never be sure if he meant it to be funny or if it just happened that way. He'd look at the people who were laughing with that slight frown on his face as if to say, "Oh, Lord, what is it this time?" Teddy had a natural 30, Jack, Queen, and King of Clubs. Chris had only 16 and went down to his ride. Teddy was shuffling the cards in his clumsy way, and I was just getting to the gooshy part of the murder story, where this deranged sailor from New Orleans was doing the Bristol stomp all over this college girl from Bryn Mawr because he couldn't stand being in closed-in places, when we heard someone coming fast up the ladder nailed to the side of the elm. A fist rapped on the underside of the trap-door. "Who goes?" Chris yelled. "Vern!" He sounded excited and out of breath. I went to the trapdoor and pulled the bolt. The trapdoor banged up, and Vern Tessio, one of the other regulars, pulled himself into the clubhouse. He was sweating buckets, and his hair, which he usually kept combed in a perfect imitation of his rock-and-roll idol, Bobby Rydell, was plastered to his bullet head in chunks and strings. "Wow, man," he panted. "Wait till you hear this." "Hear what?" I asked. "Let me get my breath. I ran all the way from my house." "I ran all the way home," Teddy wavered in a dreadful Little Anthony falsetto, "just to say I'm sorry." "Fuck your hand, man," Vern said. "Drop dead in a shed, Fred," Teddy returned smartly. "You ran all the way from your place?" Chris asked unbelievingly. "Man, you're crazy." Vern's house was 2 miles down Grand Street. "It must be 90 out there." "This is worth it," Vern said. "Holy Jeezum, you won't believe this, sincerely." He slapped his sweaty forehead to show us how sincere he was. "Okay, what?" Chris asked. "Can you guys camp out tonight?" Vern was looking at us earnestly, excitedly. His eyes looked like raisins pushed into dark circles of sweat. "I mean, if you tell your folks we're going to tent out in my back field." "Yeah, I guess so," Chris said, picking up his new hand and looking at it. "But my dad's on a mean streak. Drinking, you know." "You've got to, man," Vern said. "Sincerely, you won't believe this. Can you, Gordy?" "Probably." I was able to do most stuff like that. In fact, I'd been like the invisible boy that whole summer. In April, my older brother Dennis had been killed in a Jeep accident. That was at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he was in basic. He and another guy were on their way to the PX, and an army truck hit them broadside. Dennis was killed instantly, and his passenger had been in a coma ever since. Dennis would have been 22 later that week. I'd already picked out a birthday card for him at Daly's over in Castle Green. I cried when I heard, and I cried more at the funeral, and I couldn't believe that Dennis was gone, that anyone that used to knuckle my head or scare me with a rubber spider until I cried, or give me a kiss when I fell down and scraped both knees bloody and whisper in my ear, "Now stop crying, you baby," that a person who had touched me could be dead. It hurt me, and it scared me that he could be dead. But it seemed to have taken all the heart out of my parents. For me, Dennis was hardly more than an acquaintance. He was 10 years older than me, if you can dig it, and he had his own friends and classmates. We ate at the same table for a lot of years, and sometimes he was my friend and sometimes my tormentor, but mostly he was, just a guy. When he died, he'd been gone for a year, except for a couple of furloughs. We didn't even look alike. It took me a long time after that summer to realize that most of the tears I cried were for my mom and dad. Fat lot of good it did them, or me. "So what are you pissing and moaning about, Verno?" Teddy asked. "I knock," Chris said. "What?" Teddy screamed, immediately forgetting all about Vern. "You friggin' liar! You ain't got no pat hand! I didn't deal you no pat hand!" Chris smirked. "Make your draw, shitheap." Teddy reached for the top card on the pile of bikes. Chris reached for the Winstons on the ledge behind him. I bent over to pick up my detective magazine. Vern Tessio said, "You guys want to go see a dead body?" Everybody stopped.